The air in Unit 734 was a precisely calibrated lie. It was recycled, filtered, and ionized to a state of sterile perfection, carrying no scent, no memory, no trace of the chaotic world beyond the composite glass. Kale drew a measured breath, feeling the cool, neutral gas fill his lungs. It was the breath of control, the breath of order. He was a calibrator, first class, for the consortium. His function was to ensure emotional equilibrium, to smooth the jagged peaks of passion and the cavernous troughs of despair into a placid, manageable plateau. His own equilibrium was his most prized asset. He sat on a block of polished white resin that served as a seating platform, his spine perfectly straight, his gaze fixed on the blank wall opposite. The wall was a chromoactive surface capable of displaying cityscapes, oceanic vistas, or simulated forests. Kale preferred it blank, white, the color of a cleared slate. For 3.72 repeating hours, he had been meditating on a single, persistent anomaly, a micro-fluctuation in his own biometric readings, a slight, almost imperceptible elevation in his heart rate, a fractional increase in galvanic skin response. It had occurred precisely when the notice had slid from the data slot in his door. Unit 735, vacant for a full cycle after the decommissioning of its previous occupant, was now assigned a new neighbor. The thought should have been as neutral as the air he breathed. It was not. It felt intrusive, a variable introduced into a closed system. He smoothed the grey fabric of his uniform over his knee, the motion precise, automatic. He did not believe in sentiment. He did not believe in intuition. He believed in data, in patterns, in the elegant, unassailable logic of the consortium's mandate, peace through placidity. And yet, the data of his own body was betraying him. He had run a full diagnostic, of course. Level 3. No physiological cause, no environmental contaminants. The air was pure. The nutrient paste he had consumed for his midday meal was standard composition. The only new variable was the knowledge of an adjacent occupant. He rose, the movement fluid, silent. He walked to the single floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic, yet hermetically sealed, view of the city. Below, transport pods glided along magnetic pathways, their lights a synchronized river of cold blue and white. The city was a monument to order, a vast, intricate machine, and he was a vital, if minuscule, component. He was not a person. He was a function. Persons had attachments, messy biological imperatives that led to conflict and chaos. The pre-consortium archives were filled with such cautionary tales, epics of love and war, of jealousy and sacrifice, folly, all of it, especially the most persistent myth, the concept of fated mates. A biological, even spiritual, predetermination of emotional bonding. It was the most inefficient, illogical concept the primitive mind had ever conceived. A comforting lie whispered in the dark to stave off the terror of existential solitude. Kyle rested his forehead against the cool glass. The faint vibration of the building's core hummed through his bones. He was not alone. He was part of the whole. He was content. The lie was so practiced he almost believed it himself. Then he smelled it. A scent. It was impossible. The filtration system was absolute. But there it was, faint, yet undeniable. It was not a chemical or a synthetic fragrance. It was organic. Ozone after a lightning strike. Wet earth after a long rain. Something wild and green and utterly, terrifyingly alive. It seemed to seep through the very walls, a phantom presence invading his sanctuary. He checked the environmental controls, All systems green. Purity at 99.9998%. The scent remained, a ghost on the edge of his perception. It was coming from the hallway, from the direction of Unit 735, the source of the new variable. His hand went to the control panel by the door, his fingers hovering over the external sensor display. He could see a heat signature, the flicker of a bio monitor, as the new occupant's ident chip was registered by the building's network. He could access the data, name, designation, function. It was his right as an adjacent resident, and his duty, if he suspected an irregularity. He should do it. It was the logical course of action. But his hand remained frozen, suspended over the panel. That scent, stronger now, was pulling at something deep within him, a vestigial wire he thought had been severed at birth. It was a scent that promised complication, chaos. And for the first time in his meticulously ordered life, Kale felt a tremor of something that was not logic, not data, but a raw, uncalibrated fear. It was quickly followed by its even more terrifying twin, curiosity. The chime of his door was a soft, melodic tone, a sound he hadn't heard in cycles. No one visited a calibrator. They were summoned. He stood before the door, his own reflection a pale, indistinct spectre on its metallic surface. His grey eyes, the colour of a storm-choked sea, were wide. His biometric readings, displayed on the inside of his wrist cuff, were a chaotic scrawl. He was malfunctioning. The chime sounded again, patient. He had two choices. Ignore it, and protocol would dictate the visitor log, the non-response, and depart. Or open it. Introduce the variable directly into the system. It was illogical. It was reckless. He pressed the release. The door slid away with a near-silent hiss, and the world tilted. The scent, the impossible scent of rain and ozone and something deeply, fundamentally real, washed over him, a physical force that made him stagger a half-step back. It wasn't just a scent. It was a presence, a resonance. Standing in the sterile, white-lit corridor was the source. The man was a dissonance. He wore the standard grey residential tunic, but it was unfastened at the throat, revealing a line of tanned skin. His hair was a shade too dark, a shade too long, curling just over the collar in a way that defied regulation. But it was his eyes that broke the system. They were the colour of moss, of deep forest shadow. And they were looking not at Kale's face, but through it, as if they saw the frantic, malfunctioning code beneath the surface. And in that instant, a connection sparked between them. It was not a metaphor. It was a tangible, electrical arc, a jolt of high-voltage data that bypassed every firewall Kyle had ever built. His vision fractured. For a nanosecond, he was not in his doorway. He was standing on a cliff, the wind tearing at his clothes, the taste of salt on his lips. He felt a phantom ache in his left shoulder, a deep, old sorrow that was not his own, and an overwhelming, illogical surge of recognition. It was like seeing a reflection in a pool of still water, only to have the reflection turn and look back with an intelligence all its own. The man, the new neighbor, flinched, his own eyes widening. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Kale could feel him. He could feel the other man's shock, his confusion, and beneath it, a slow dawning wonder that was 1,000 times more dangerous than fear. It was an empathic feedback loop, a cascading system failure. He was compromised. His most fundamental programming, emotional isolation, had been breached by a single glance. Kyle reacted with the only instinct he had left: control. He severed the connection. The mental motion was a violent, reflexive slam, like dropping a blast shield over a reactor core. The world snapped back into focus. The sterile corridor, the humming lights, the man standing before him, swaying slightly, his face pale. "Can I help you?" Kyle's voice was a stranger's, clipped and cold, scraped from the depths of his training. It was the voice he used for non-compliant subjects. The man blinked, the moss-green eyes clearing slowly. He seemed to be struggling for breath. I'm Elian, Unit 735. I just moved in." He gestured vaguely with a hand. In it, he held a small, unidentifiable object, a piece of dark, polished wood, an artifact, utterly non-regulation. There was a power fluctuation. I wondered if you experienced it. A power fluctuation. That was what he called it. The elegant, euphemistic language of someone trying to name the unnameable. Kyle's internal systems screamed at him. Threat, anomaly, contagion. "All systems in my unit are functioning within normal parameters," Kyle stated. It was a dismissal. It was a wall. He needed the door closed. He needed the variable contained. Elian looked from Kyle's face to the object in his own hand, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "Ah, well, I brought this. A neighborly gesture, they used to call it." He offered the piece of wood. Kyle stared at it. It was smooth, carved with intricate, flowing lines that were not the precise geometric patterns of the consortium. It was organic, asymmetrical, flawed, beautiful. He felt a terrifying urge to touch it, to feel its texture against his skin. "Such gestures are inefficient and unnecessary," Kyle said, his voice flat. He took a deliberate step back, initiating the door's closure sequence. Elian's expression shifted from confusion to something else. Not offense, not anger. A quiet, knowing sadness. It was the look of a man who had expected this reaction, but had hoped, foolishly, for another. "Of course," Elian murmured, his hand dropping to his side. "My apologies for the intrusion." The door slid shut, a clean metallic slice that cut the connection, cut the scent, cut the sight of those impossible eyes. Kyle stood in the sudden silence of his unit, his back pressed against the cold metal. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, a chaotic, asynchronous beat that defied all calibration. He was not an asset. He was not a function. He was a system in catastrophic failure. He raised a trembling hand to his face. The air, his pure, sterile air, now held a ghost of a scent. Ozone and wet earth. He had let the variable in, and it had left a trace. He stumbled to the small sanitation unit, splashing cold, recycled water on his face. He stared at his reflection in the polished chrome. The face looking back was his own, but the eyes were haunted. He had shared a moment of another's existence. He had felt another's past. Fated mates were a myth, a comforting lie, a dangerous, pre-rational delusion. He repeated the words to himself, a mantra against the chaos. But the data did not support the conclusion. The data, the raw, undeniable sensory data, suggested something else entirely. It suggested that the most dangerous myths were the ones that turned out to be true. He was a calibrator. His purpose was to quantify and control emotion. But what he had just experienced was not quantifiable. It defied every metric, every algorithm. It was a singularity, a bug in the code of reality itself. And it lived next door. Kale spent the next rotation cycle attempting to restore order. He did not succeed. His focus, usually a laser-sharp instrument capable of dissecting the most complex emotional data streams, was fractured. It was as if a virus had been introduced into his core processing, a background program that consumed resources and threw off his calculations. The virus had a name: Elian. He sat at his terminal, the cool light of the data slate illuminating his face, and tried to work. He was analyzing the biometric feedback from a low-level administrator in the hydroponics division, a subject flagged for elevated serotonin and a pattern of non-productive daydreaming. It was a simple case, a textbook recalibration protocol, yet Kale found himself staring at the sine wave of the man's respiratory rate and seeing not data, but the rise and fall of a sleeping chest. He heard the whisper-faint sound of Elian moving in the adjacent unit, Ayao's soft footfall, the slide of a drawer, the clink of ceramic, and his own breath would catch in his throat. He ran a level 4 diagnostic on himself, then a 5, pushing past authorized parameters. The results were alarming. His baseline neurological state was no longer a stable line, but a volatile, oscillating wave. His dream state logs were even more disturbing. They were no longer blank, silent voids of restorative unconsciousness. They were filled with fragmented images, the sting of salt spray, the rough texture of carved wood, the color of moss in deep shade. He was contaminated. He attempted to purge the intrusive data, running defrag and memory wipe protocols that were both painful and ineffective. The sensations, the phantom memories, would recede for a time, only to return with greater intensity, like an echo gaining strength. He tried to rationalize it. Proximity-induced empathic transference, a rare but documented neurological phenomenon, especially between individuals with compatible synaptic resonance patterns. The consortium's literature was clear. Such an event was a malfunction, a biochemical short circuit. The prescribed treatment was immediate separation, and if necessary, synaptic dampening. He should report it. It was his duty. But the thought of a white, uniformed medical technician sliding a dampening needle into his neck, of having this terrifying, vibrant anomaly scrubbed from his mind, filled him with a cold dread that was, in itself, a reportable emotion. He stood from his terminal and paced the confines of his small unit. 4 steps to the window, 4 steps back. A perfect, contained loop. But the walls felt thinner now. He could feel Elian's presence through the composite plaster, a low, steady hum of life that was a constant, distracting vibration against his own field. He could almost map the man's movements, his states of being. Now, he was still, his breathing slow and deep, meditating, or perhaps sleeping. Now a spike in his heart rate, a surge of what? Frustration, creativity. The ambiguity was maddening. Kale was a man who traded in the certainty of data, and Elian was a cloud of unreadable, chaotic variables. He pressed his hand against the wall that separated their units. It was cool and smooth, inert, but he imagined he could feel a faint warmth, a resonance bleeding through from the other side. He snatched his hand back as if burned. This was insanity. He was projecting, creating patterns where none existed. He was a scientist, a logician. He would treat this as a scientific problem. He needed data. He returned to his terminal, his fingers flying across the light-sensitive surface. With his override codes, he accessed the central residential database. It was a breach of protocol, a severe one, but necessity had overridden his programming. Elian. No last name listed. Designation: Artifact Archivist Sub-Level Gamma. A meaningless title. Sub-Level Gamma was a repository for pre-consortium cultural ephemera deemed too insignificant for destruction but too dangerous for general access. It was a dead-end assignment, a place for dissidents and dreamers to be forgotten. His file was heavily redacted. His place of origin was a classified sector, a fringe colony known for its lax adherence to consortium emotional mandates. His medical records were suspiciously clean, a perfect, flat line of biometric stability that Kyle knew, with gut-wrenching certainty, was fabricated. The man was a ghost in the system, an intentional anomaly, and he had been placed, with deliberate precision, next to a first-class calibrator. This was not a random housing assignment. It was a test, or a trap. The realization did not calm him, it terrified him further. If the consortium was testing him, he was already failing. His every interaction, his every internal fluctuation was likely being monitored. The overseers did not tolerate malfunction. They corrected it permanently. He shut down the terminal, plunging the room into semi-darkness. He was not an experiment. He was not a data point in someone else's equation. He repeated the words, but they had lost their power. The scent of rain and earth lingered in the air, a constant reminder of his contamination. He went to the door, his hand hovering over the external viewer. He could watch Elian's comings and goings, collect data, build a profile. It was the logical, tactical thing to do. He activated the viewer. The corridor was empty. He scanned back through the timed logs. At 03:17, Elian had left his unit. He had paused outside Kyle's door. He had not rung the chime. He had simply stood there for a full minute, his head tilted as if listening. Then he had placed something on the floor, a small, dark object, and he had walked away. Kyle stared at the image on the screen. The object was still there, right outside his door. It was a direct communication, a deliberate breach of the sterile distance between them. It was a challenge. He had to retrieve it. To leave it there would be an admission of its effect on him. To ignore it was impossible. He deactivated the viewer. The image of the small, dark shape burned into his mind. He took a breath, attempting to center himself, to find that placid plateau of calm that had been his home for his entire life. But the plateau was gone. In its place was a knife's edge, a precarious balance between a lifetime of control and a single, terrifying moment of connection. He opened the door. From his position across the hall, pressed into the shallow alcove of a utility access panel, Elian watched. He held his breath, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He was not an archivist. That was a cover, a convenient fiction provided by the very system he sought to understand. He was a collector, but not of artifacts. He collected moments, resonances, the faint, lingering echoes of a humanity the consortium was trying to erase. He had felt them his whole life, the psychic residue of strong emotions, clinging to places and objects like faint perfume. A flicker of joy from a child's toy found in the reclamation vats, a pang of loss from a discarded data chip, but he had never felt anything like the current that had arced between him and the man in Unit 734. It had been like touching a live power conduit, a raw, concentrated stream of existence. Loneliness so profound it had the density of a collapsed star. Intelligence as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. And beneath it all, a buried, volcanic core of feeling, fiercely suppressed. He had known, in that instant, what the old texts called it, the bond, the resonance, a myth to the consortium, a capital offense. He had spent his life searching for proof of its existence, and he had found it in the storm-grey eyes of a man who was the living embodiment of everything designed to destroy it. A calibrator. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He watched now as the calibrator, Kyle, the building network had informed him, opened his door. The movement was hesitant, a stark contrast to the rigid control he had projected during their first meeting. Kyle peered into the empty corridor, his gaze immediately locking onto the object on the floor. It was a stone, a simple, smooth river stone, dark and cool, that Elian had carried with him from his off-world home. It was a piece of the real, a fragment of a world that was not manufactured. He had left it as an offering, a question. Kyle took a step out of his unit, his bare feet silent on the polished floor. He was dressed in the same simple grey tunic as before, but it seemed less a uniform now and more a shroud. He moved with a predator's caution, his eyes scanning the corridor. Elian flattened himself further into the shadows, slowing his breathing, damping his own emotional field as best he could. He did not want to be seen. This was Kyle's moment. The calibrator reached the stone. He did not pick it up immediately. He crouched, his body a study in tension, and simply looked at it. Elian could feel the conflict radiating from him, a chaotic static of logic warring with instinct. To Kale, this stone was not a gift. It was a piece of contraband, a piece of evidence, a test. Finally, Kale's fingers, long and pale, reached out. They trembled slightly as they brushed against the stone's surface. The moment his skin made contact, Elian felt it too. A jolt. Not as powerful as the first, but a clear, undeniable echo. He felt a phantom coolness in his own palm, a ghost of smooth, worn texture. He saw Kale flinch, his hand recoiling, but he did not pull away completely. He took a shuddering breath, then, with a new, deliberate slowness, he closed his hand around the stone. His eyes squeezed shut. Elian felt a wave of information wash over him, a dizzying flood of sensation from Kyle's side of the bond. The cold, analytical precision of a mind cataloging data, the shock of an unexpected texture, the sudden, overwhelming memory of a child's hand, Kyle's own, being slapped away from a rough, unprocessed piece of wood in a consortium creche. "Do not touch that which is unrefined," a disembodied voice had commanded. "Perfection lies in smoothness, in uniformity." The memory faded, leaving a lingering ache of shame and confusion. Kale stood up, the stone clutched in his fist. He did not look around. He turned and retreated back into his unit, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving the corridor empty and silent once more. Elian leaned his head back against the cool metal of the wall, his own hand opening and closing, the ghost of the stone still palpable in his palm. He had his answer. The bond was real, and it was terrifyingly strong, but it was also a death sentence. The consortium didn't just suppress these connections, they hunted them. A resonant pair was a rogue state, a two-person network that operated outside their control. They were a threat to the placid order of things. He had come here seeking answers, following the faint trail of redacted files and whispers of a calibrator whose efficiency ratings were so high they bordered on the unnatural. He had theorized that such perfect control could only be achieved by someone with an immense, innate capacity for emotion, a powerful empath who had learned to turn his abilities inward, silencing himself before he could be silenced. He had not expected to find this. He had not expected his theory to have a name, a face, and a soul that called to his own across a sterile hallway. He pushed himself away from the wall. He had to be careful. He had put them both in incredible danger. Kyle was a prisoner in a cage of his own making, and Elian had just handed him the key. But a key can be used to lock a door just as easily as it can be used to open one. And from the terror he had felt radiating from the Calator, Elian suspected that Kale would do everything in his power to lock that door forever and throw the key into the void. He returned to his own unit, the silence of the corridor settling behind him. His apartment was the antithesis of Kyle's. The walls were not blank. They were covered in salvaged data slates displaying fragments of pre-consortium art. A small, illegal hydroponics unit sat in the corner, a single stubborn green vine climbing towards the synthesized light. It was a pocket of controlled chaos. He sat on his own resin block and looked at his hands. He was an archivist of a dying world, and he had just discovered its most vital and most endangered artifact. The stone sat on Kyle's sterile white counter, a singularity in his ordered universe. It was a dense point of chaos, absorbing the light, defying the room's clean geometry. He had tried to dispose of it. He had held it over the molecular reclamation chute, his fingers poised to release it. But he could not. To drop it felt like severing a limb. The sensation was illogical, a sentimental phantom. But it was potent. Instead, he studied it. He ran it through his personal materials scanner. Composition, sedimentary silicate, traces of iron oxide, feldspar. Origin, non-terrestrial, consistent with geological formations in the outer sectors. It was just a rock, a piece of debris from a forgotten world. Yet when he held it, the universe seemed to shift. The phantom sensations grew stronger, more frequent. He was at his terminal, calibrating a subject's anxiety levels. When he tasted salt, sharp and clean on his tongue, he checked his nutrient intake logs. No sodium. He closed his eyes and saw, for a flickering instant, a vast grey ocean under a bruised purple sky. Elian. It had to be Elian, remembering a place, a taste. Later, while performing his nightly stretches, a sequence of 27 precise movements, a sudden, sharp pain lanced through his right hand. He dropped to his knee, hissing, clutching his fingers. He examined them. No cut, no bruise, no sign of injury. The pain was real, visceral, but its source was absent. Seconds later, it vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving a tingling ghost. Through the wall, he heard a muffled curse, then the sound of running water. Elian had cut himself. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through him. This was not mere empathic leakage. Their systems were integrating, their neurological boundaries blurring. He was losing himself. He was becoming a we, the most terrifying pronoun in the consortium lexicon. The next day, his fears were given a face. He was performing a routine audit on a junior data analyst when the door to the calibration chamber slid open. Overseer Thorn stood there, a pale, skeletal figure in a pristine white uniform that seemed to radiate a chill. Thorn was the embodiment of the consortium's will, calm, precise, and utterly implacable. "Calibrator," Thorn said. The voice was soft, synthesized, devoid of inflection. A moment. Kale disengaged from the analyst, whose face was a mask of placid relief. He rose and faced the overseer, his posture a perfect model of deference. "Overseer, an unscheduled visit." "An observation," Thorn corrected gently. "Your recent performance metrics have shown a deviation from the mean, a slight but persistent increase in processing time, and your own biometric baseline is exhibiting volatility." The overseer's eyes, magnified by thick optical lenses, scanned Kyle's face. It felt like being dissected by a pair of cold, sterile scalpels. "I have been undertaking a complex series of self-diagnostics," Kale said, the lie smooth and practiced. "It has temporarily diverted some processing resources." Thorne's head tilted a fraction of a degree. "Indeed, self-diagnosis can often lead to a flawed interpretation of data. One's own perspective is inherently limited." The overseer took a step into the room, gliding silently over the polished floor. "We have noted the arrival of a new variable in your residential block. Unit 735, an archivist from the outer sectors." The words were dropped like stones into a still pond. Kale's entire focus narrowed to a single point, maintaining his composure. He kept his heart rate steady through sheer force of will, a trick of metabolic control he had perfected over years. He could feel the overseer's passive scan probing his emotional field, searching for the telltale spike of anxiety, of deception. "Residential assignments are outside my purview," Kale said, his voice a perfect monotone. "A regrettable but necessary distraction," Thorne mused, seeming to accept the answer. "The work of an archivist dealing with the chaotic artifacts of the past, it can create a certain emotional residue. Be vigilant, calibrator. Proximity can lead to contamination." The overseer's gaze flickered towards Kale's right hand, which he had unconsciously clenched into a fist. The ghost of the pain Elian had felt lingered there. "We would be disappointed to see our most efficient asset compromised." The veiled threat hung in the air, as cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade. "My efficiency is not compromised, Overseer," Kale said. "It is assured." Thorne held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "See that it is." The overseer turned and glided out of the chamber, leaving Kale alone with the humming machines and the lingering chill of his presence. Kale stood frozen, the blood roaring in his ears. He was being watched. The arrival of Elian, his own subsequent instability, it was all part of a pattern that the consortium's analytical engines would not miss. They were testing the system. They had placed a source of chaos next to a pillar of order to see which would break first. He had to sever the connection. He had to prove to Thorne, to the system, and to himself that he was immune, that he was in control. That evening, he did not wait for Elian to make a move. He went to his neighbor's door. He did not bring a gift. He brought an ultimatum. He raised his hand to activate the chime, but before he could, the door hissed open. Elian stood there, not with surprise, but with a look of quiet expectation. He was holding a steaming mug, and the scent of some dark, bitter herb filled the corridor. Kyle tasted it on his own tongue. "I knew you were coming," Elian said softly. "I felt the static." "We need to talk," Kyle said, his voice harder than he intended. Elian nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." Kyle hesitated. To enter Elian's space was to cross a threshold, to admit a level of engagement he had been fighting to deny. But to have this conversation in the monitored hallway was foolish. He stepped inside. The inside of Unit 735 was a profound shock to Kyle's system. It was the same physical space as his own, the same dimensions, the same window. But it was not the same universe. Where Kyle's unit was a study in white, sterile minimalism, Elian's was a riot of texture and muted color. The walls were hung with pieces of faded, woven fabric. Shelves, constructed from what looked like reclaimed packing crates, were filled with books, physical books with paper pages and printed spines, and strange hand-carved objects. A single vibrant green plant with broad, waxy leaves sat in a pot by the window, its tendrils reaching for the artificial sunlight. The air, far from being filtered and neutral, was thick with the scent of the herb in Elian's mug, the dry, dusty smell of old paper, and the underlying vital scent of ozone and living soil that Kale now irrevocably associated with the man himself. It was an assault on the senses. It was messy, disordered, alive. "You wanted to talk," Elian said, gesturing to a low cushion on the floor. Kyle remained standing, his posture rigid. He could not get comfortable here. To relax would be to surrender. "This connection between us," Kyle began, dispensing with preamble. "It is a malfunction, a neurological anomaly." Elian took a slow sip from his mug, his moss-green eyes watching Kale over the rim. "Is that what you call it? A malfunction?" "It is a quantifiable, observable phenomenon," Kyle insisted, his voice tight. "Proximity-induced empathic transference. It is disruptive. It is compromising my efficiency." "Your efficiency." Elian repeated the word slowly, as if tasting it. He set the mug down on a small, unsteady table. "You feel me cutting my hand. I taste the nutrient paste you eat for lunch. It tastes like chalk, by the way. You should try to get some real food." "This is not a matter for levity," Kale snapped. "This bond is a liability. For both of us. It must be severed." Elian looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than calm curiosity appeared in his eyes. It was a deep, profound sadness. "You can't sever it, Kale. You can only ignore it, suppress it. And I think you've been doing that your entire life. This is just the first time someone has been close enough to feel the strain." The words hit Kale with physical force. He thought of the constant, low-level effort it took to maintain his placid exterior, the endless self-diagnostics, the mental exercises, the cage. "You know nothing about me," Kale said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "I know you're afraid," Elian said simply. The statement was not an accusation. It was a fact, and it disarmed Kale completely. "What do you want from me?" Kale asked, the question a raw admission of his own confusion. "Nothing," Elian replied. "I just want you to stop being afraid of yourself." "The consortium doesn't tolerate fear," Kale countered. "It calibrates it." "It eradicates it," Elian corrected him gently. "Along with joy and grief and love. They don't want a plateau, Kyle. They want a flat line, and they are very, very good at what they do." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Why do you think they hide the archives? Why do they destroy art? Because it reminds us that there is more to existence than placid functionality. It reminds us of this." He gestured between the two of them. "This connection isn't a malfunction. It's the original code. The one they've been trying to write over for generations." Kyle stared at him, his mind racing. It was sedition. It was heresy. The words themselves were enough to warrant decommissioning, but they resonated with a terrifying, undeniable truth. He thought of the overseer, of the cold, implied threat. He thought of the stone in his room, the small piece of reality he couldn't bring himself to discard. He was standing on a precipice. Behind him was the cold, sterile safety of the system he had always known. In front of him was Elian, a man who spoke of feelings as if they were not a disease, a man who lived in a pocket of beautiful, dangerous chaos. "I am a calibrator," Kyle said, the words a desperate reaffirmation of his identity. "It is my function to restore order." "Then what do you do?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "When you realize the order itself is the malfunction." And then it happened. As Elian spoke, the connection between them flared, brighter and more intense than ever before. It was not a gentle leakage of sensation this time. It was a full-scale data breach. Kyle's vision dissolved. He was no longer in Elian's apartment. He was somewhere else, a memory. But it was not his memory, and it was not Elian's. It was shared. He saw a room, white and clinical, much like his own calibration chamber. Two figures, a man and a woman, sat in chairs, their faces placid, their eyes empty. A younger version of Overseer Thorn was observing them through a pane of glass. "The final stage of the dampening is complete," Thorn's voice echoed, younger, but just as cold. "The resonant bond has been successfully severed. They will no longer be a threat." The scene shifted. Kyle saw the same man and woman, years later, their faces still smooth, still empty. They were holding a small child, a child with storm-grey eyes. The woman smoothed the child's hair with a hand that was gentle but held no warmth. The man looked at the child, but his gaze was distant, as if looking at a complex but ultimately uninteresting piece of data. "He shows a high capacity for empathy," the man's voice said, devoid of fatherly pride. "He will need careful calibration." The memory shattered, and Kale was back in Elian's room, gasping for air, his hands braced against the wall to keep from falling. He was looking at Elian, whose own face was a mask of shock and dawning horror. They had not just shared a memory. They had accessed a piece of the consortium's hidden history. And Kyle understood. The man and woman, the child with grey eyes, his parents. They hadn't been decommissioned for emotional instability, as his file stated. They had been a resonant pair, like him and Elian. And the consortium had not just calibrated them, it had broken them. It had severed the part of them that made them human, and then given them a child to raise. A child they were charged with conditioning to ensure the same malfunction did not arise in him. His entire life, his training, his very identity as a calibrator, it wasn't a career. It was a cage built for him before he was even born, a preventative measure. The order he had dedicated his life to upholding was not just a malfunction. It was a lie, a monstrous, soul-crushing lie. He looked at Elian, and the fear was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer the fear of connection. It was the fear of what the world looked like without it. The silence in the room was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Kyle's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The memory, the revelation, had been a seismic event, shattering the foundations of his world. His parents. The word itself was an alien concept. They were his progenitors, the two units responsible for his biological creation. He had their file, a dry collection of data points, service records, efficiency ratings, and a final clinical note on their decommissioning due to emotional degradation. It had all been a fabrication, a clean, neat story to cover a brutal truth. They had been bonded. They had felt what he was feeling now with Elian. And the consortium, the system he served, had ripped it out of them. They had vivisected their souls and left two placid, functional shells behind. He looked at his own hands, seeing them for the first time not as the precise instruments of a calibrator, but as the legacy of two broken people. The empathy they had passed on to him, the very trait that made the bond with Elian possible, was the same thing the consortium had identified as a threat. His training hadn't been an education. It had been an inoculation. They had tried to make him immune to himself. Kyle. Elian's voice was soft, tentative, pulling him back from the spiraling abyss of his thoughts. He had taken a step closer, his hands held up, palms out, in a gesture of non-aggression, a gesture of peace. Kyle flinched away, a raw animal instinct for self-preservation taking over. He couldn't be near him. The proximity was the cause. The connection was the wound. Did you know? Kyle's voice was a raw whisper, torn from his throat. Did you know what they were? No, Elian said, his face etched with a pained sincerity. I've read fragments, whispers in the redacted archives, theories about resonant pairs being repurposed or neutralized. But I never saw it. Not like that. He looked at Kyle, his green eyes filled with a compassion that was almost physically painful to witness. They were your progenitors. Kyle didn't need to confirm it. Elian had seen the memory too. He had seen the child with grey eyes. He knew. The shared knowledge was a new kind of intimacy, a terrifying, unbreakable link forged in the trauma of that revelation. Kyle sank to the floor, his legs no longer able to support him. The carefully constructed persona of the first-class calibrator crumbled, leaving behind a terrified man, adrift in the ruins of his life. He wrapped his arms around himself, a futile attempt to hold his fracturing self together. All my life, he murmured, the words addressed to the floor, to the dust motes dancing in the artificial light. Every emotion I ever felt, joy, fear, anger, I diagnosed it. I saw it as a symptom, a sickness to be cured. They taught me to do it to others because they had already done it to me. He finally looked up at Elian, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Another reportable offense. I am a weapon they designed to use against myself. For a long moment, Elian did not move. He simply stood there, bearing witness to Kale's collapse. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell him it would be all right. His presence was a quiet, steady anchor in the storm of Kyle's unraveling. Then he slowly knelt down, not crowding him, but bringing himself to the same level. He reached out, not to touch Kale, but to the space between them. He picked up the mug he had set down earlier. The herbal tea was cold now. My grandmother used to make this, Elian said, his voice a low, soothing murmur. She was from the outer sectors. She used to say that some memories are too heavy to carry alone. He offered the mug to Kale. Kyle stared at it. It was a simple, ceramic thing, imperfectly shaped, with a faint crack near the handle. It was real, like the stone, like Elian. He reached out with a trembling hand and took it. The ceramic was cool against his skin. He brought it to his lips and drank. The tea was bitter, earthy, with a strange, floral aftertaste. It tasted alive. It tasted of a world outside the consortium. As he drank, he felt a flicker of another memory through the bond, this one from Elian. A small, sun-drenched room. An old woman with kind eyes and hands as wrinkled as dried leaves, crushing herbs in a stone bowl. The scent of the tea, but warm this time, and filled with a sense of safety, of love. The memory was a balm on his raw nerves. Kale lowered the mug, his hand no longer shaking. He looked at Elian, who was watching him with an expression of intense focus and vulnerability. The fear was gone from Elian's eyes, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. "They're not going to do it to us," Elian said, his voice firm. It wasn't a question. It was a vow. Kyle felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in years. Not since he was a small child, before the calibrations had taken full root. It was a fragile, tentative thing. It was hope. "They are watching me," Kyle said, the practical, analytical part of his mind reasserting itself, assessing the new, terrifying variables. Overseer Thorn. He suspects something, the shared memory. If they can detect that, then we have to be smarter than they are, Elian countered. They monitor for emotional spikes, for chaos. We will give them calm. We will give them order. He leaned in closer, the scent of him, of rain and earth, filling Kyle's senses. This bond, Kale, it's not just a vulnerability. It's a tool, a private channel. They can monitor our words, our biometrics, but they can't monitor this. Not if we learn to control it. Kyle stared at him. Control it. The idea was radical. He had only ever thought of severing it, of suppressing it, to use it, to explore it deliberately. It was the most dangerous, most defiant act he could imagine. "How?" Kale asked, the single word a surrender and a plea. Elian's mouth curved into a small, sad smile. "I don't know," he admitted. "But the archives are full of stories, myths. They call it the silent language, the path of the heart. We'll have to learn together. Learn together." The words hung in the air, a promise of shared risk, of a shared future. For the first time, Kale did not feel like a system in failure. He felt like a man on the verge of a terrifying, necessary transformation. He was not alone. He looked down at the empty mug in his hands, then back at Elian. The journey from his door to Elian's had been a few short steps, but the journey he was about to embark on would take him further than he had ever imagined. The days that followed were a study in duality. On the surface, Kale was more exemplary than ever. He arrived at the calibration chamber early. His reports were concise, his analyses flawless. He projected an aura of such profound, unshakable calm that even Overseer Thorn, during another spontaneous observation, seemed satisfied. Thorn's passive scans would have registered Kale's biometric data as a perfect, placid lake. But beneath the surface, a revolution was taking place. The placid lake was a carefully constructed illusion, a firewall behind which a storm raged. Kyle and Elian began their clandestine education. They started not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate acts of connection. Elian would brew his herbal tea, and Kyle, sitting in his own sterile unit, would focus, reaching for the taste, the warmth. At first, he only got faint, ghostly impressions. But as he learned to quiet the analytical part of his mind, to simply listen with senses he never knew he had, the sensations grew stronger, clearer. He would sit, eyes closed, and taste the bitter floral warmth on his tongue as if he were holding the mug himself. In return, Kale would share the only thing he had in abundance, data. He would focus on a complex algorithm, a string of code, and project the pure, cold logic of it across the bond. Elian, who confessed to finding consortium tech a so baffling chore, described the experience as like having a song made of numbers sung directly into my brain. They were building a new language, one of sensations, emotions, and pure information, a silent, unmonitorable stream of data flowing between their two minds. It was in this silent space that they truly began to know each other. Elian showed Kale his past, not in a rush of memory, but in quiet, sensory snapshots, the feeling of rough, warm sand from the beaches of his home world, the sharp, clean scent of the metallic ink he used for his forbidden calligraphy, the deep, resonant ache of loneliness he had carried with him his entire life, the feeling of being a radio receiver in a world that had forgotten how to broadcast. Kale's own offerings were more hesitant. His past was a curated, sterile thing, but he found moments to share. The quiet satisfaction of solving a particularly difficult diagnostic puzzle. The cool, smooth feel of the resin seating block beneath his hands. A sensation of stability in a world he now knew was a lie. The one thing they never shared directly was the memory of Kyle's parents. It lay between them, a deep, silent ocean of shared trauma. To touch it felt too dangerous, too raw, but its presence was a constant, unspoken motivator. They were not just exploring their connection for its own sake. They were training for a war they knew was coming. The intimacy of their silent communion began to bleed into their physical reality. One evening, Kyle was staring at the blank white wall of his unit when a sudden, overwhelming image flooded his mind. A charcoal drawing of a bird, its wings outstretched in defiant flight. The image was so vivid, so real, that he reached out a hand to touch it. There was nothing there, but the impulse, the beauty of the image, remained. A moment later, a soft chime sounded at his door. He opened it to find Elian standing there, a faint, nervous smile on his face. In his hand, he held a sheet of flimsy paper. On it was a charcoal drawing of a bird, its wings outstretched, the exact image from his mind. "I thought your wall looked a little empty," Elian said, his voice soft. Kyle took the drawing, his fingers tracing the bold black lines. It was the first piece of art, the first non-functional object other than the river stone that he had ever held. It was a piece of Elian's soul, made manifest. "It's non-regulation," Kale said, but the words had no heat. His voice was thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I won't tell if you don't," Elian whispered, his eyes sparkling. That night, Kale did not put the drawing in a drawer. He did not dispose of it. He affixed it to the center of his blank white wall. It was a small act of rebellion, a single, beautiful flaw in the heart of his perfect, sterile world. It was a declaration, but their growing connection did not go unnoticed. The system was designed to detect anomalies, and they were the greatest anomaly of all. One cycle, as Kyle was leaving his unit for his shift, he noticed a new addition to the corridor wall. A tiny, almost invisible optical sensor, no bigger than a pinhead, perfectly positioned to have a clear line of sight to both his door and Elian's. His blood ran cold. The passive observation phase was over. They were under active surveillance. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to send a single word. He projected the image of the sensor, along with a cold, sharp spike of fear and urgency, directly into Elian's mind. The response was instantaneous, not panic, but a deep, resonant calm, a feeling of a steady hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," the feeling said. "They can only see the outside. They can't see us." The message was clear. They had to be more careful than ever. Their silent world was their only sanctuary, their only true reality. The world outside, the monitored corridor, the calibration chamber, the entire city, was now just a stage, and they had to play their parts perfectly until the time came to make their escape. The pressure was immense. Kale felt like he was living two lives, the cold, efficient calibrator by day, and by night, a student, a partner, a man slowly, terrifyingly coming alive. The strain was beginning to show in small ways. He found himself pausing before a reflective surface, surprised by the stranger looking back at him. The face was his, but the eyes held a new depth, a new light. He was no longer a component. He was a man, and that man was in love. He had never allowed himself to form the word in his own mind before. It was a pre-rational concept, a biochemical delusion. But as he sat in his silent room, feeling the steady, comforting presence of Elian through the wall, feeling the shared pulse of their linked existence, no other word would suffice. It was not a chaotic, inefficient passion. It was a quiet, profound certainty. It was the calm in the eye of the storm. He closed his eyes, sinking into the connection, letting it wash over him. He sent a single, simple feeling across the bond, not the word, but the essence of it, a feeling of gratitude, of safety, of coming home. The response was immediate, a wave of warmth that started in his chest and spread to every corner of his being, and with it a single, clear image from Elian's mind, two hands clasped together against a backdrop of stars. The illusion of calm could not last. The system was a patient predator, and its tendrils were tightening around them. Kale's work assignments grew more complex, more demanding. He was tasked with calibrating high-level officials, individuals whose emotional landscapes were not just messy, but treacherous, filled with ambition and paranoia. It was draining work, requiring every ounce of his concentration to maintain his own facade while navigating the psychic turmoil of others. He knew it was a test. Thorn and the unseen powers of the consortium were pushing him, applying pressure to see where the cracks would appear. He would finish his shifts, his mind aching with fatigue, and retreat to the sanctuary of his unit, to the silent communion with Elian that was his only solace. But even that sanctuary felt besieged. The sensor in the hall was joined by others. He detected subtle changes in the building's energy signatures, the telltale signs of enhanced audio and biometric monitoring. They were living in a glass cage. Elian, too, felt the pressure. His trips to the archives were now frequently shadowed by nondescript figures in grey uniforms. His data access was restricted. They were being isolated, penned in, their options slowly being stripped away. The fear was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their connection. One night, the hum spiked into a sharp, piercing alarm. Kale was jolted from a light sleep by a wave of pure terror from Elian's side of the bond. It was cold, sharp, and utterly debilitating. He sat bolt upright, his heart pounding. He reached out with his mind. Elian, what is it? The response was a chaotic jumble of images, a darkened corridor in the sub-levels, a redacted file on a data slate. The title was stark: Project Chimera, Resonant Pair Neutralization Protocols. Then the image of a face, pale and terrified. A fellow archivist, a friend of Elian's, being dragged away by two white uniformed enforcers. He'd been caught accessing forbidden history. He'd been caught looking for the truth. They know, Elian projected, the thought a shard of ice in Kyle's mind. They know someone is digging. They're purging the archives. They're coming. The time for quiet defiance was over. The stage they were performing on was about to collapse. Kyle's mind, trained for crisis and analysis, snapped into focus. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, a whetstone to sharpen his thoughts. Pack nothing, he sent to Elian, the command clear and absolute. Physical objects are a liability. They can be tracked. All we need is here. He tapped his own temple. Meet me on the roof in 10 minutes. Go now. He didn't wait for a reply. He knew Elian understood. He swung his legs off the resin block and moved with a silent, fluid grace. He wiped his personal terminal, a cascade of encrypted code erasing his every keystroke, every illegal search. He walked to the wall and took down the charcoal drawing of the bird. He held it for a moment, the fragile paper a tangible link to the life he was about to lose, and the man he was trying to save. With a deep, aching regret, he fed it into the reclamation chute. It dissolved into grey atoms. No evidence, no attachments. He put on a dark, heavy maintenance cloak he'd acquired from the quartermaster, a non-regulation item he justified as necessary for off-site calibrations. It would obscure his heat signature and his face. As he turned to the door, his gaze fell on the river stone, still sitting on his counter. He hesitated. It was a physical object, a liability. But it was also their beginning, a symbol. He snatched it up, its familiar weight a comfort in his palm, and slipped it into a pocket. He opened his door and stepped into the corridor. The tiny red light of the optical sensor blinked, recording his every move. Let it. By the time they analyzed the footage, he would be gone. He didn't take the main lifts. He took the service stairs, a dark, narrow shaft that smelled of ozone and lubricant. The climb was 20 floors, and he took them 2 at a time. His body, honed by years of precise, controlled exercise, responding flawlessly. He felt Elian's presence as a beacon in his mind, a point of light in the darkness, pulling him forward. Elian was already there. He was standing near the edge of the rooftop, the wind whipping his dark hair across his face. The city spread out below them, a vast, glittering web of light and order. Their prison. Elian turned as Kale approached, his face pale in the glow of the city lights. He wore a similar cloak. The fear Kale had felt from him was gone, replaced by a grim, steady resolve. "They're coming for my unit," Elian said, his voice almost lost in the wind. Kale didn't need him to say it. He could feel it. A tremor in the building's network, a lockdown protocol being initiated, doors sliding shut, lifts freezing. They were sealing the block. "Thorn?" Kale asked. Elian nodded. "I felt his focus. He's directing it himself. He's on his way." They were out of time. They had minutes, if that. Kale looked around the rooftop. It was a forest of communication arrays, atmospheric sensors, and ventilation units, and on the far side, a maintenance platform, a small one-man vehicle used for repairing the building's upper facade. It wasn't fast. It wasn't shielded. But it was a way out. "There," Kyle said, pointing. Elian's eyes followed his gaze. "Can you fly it?" "I can access its systems," Kyle replied. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. His mind, linked with the building's network for his entire residency, knew every line of code, every back door. A sound from below made them both freeze. The heavy metallic clang of the rooftop access door being forced. They saw the glow of plasma cutters slicing through the reinforced lock. "Go!" Kyle yelled, the word a raw bark. They ran. The wind tore at their cloaks, trying to pull them back. The maintenance platform was 50 meters away, across an open expanse of rooftop. It felt like a kilometer. Kale's mind was already there, weaving through the platform's primitive security protocols, a dance of code and bypasses. He felt the machine systems respond, the engine whining to life. Behind them, the door burst open. 2 figures in white, armored enforcement uniforms stepped onto the roof, plasma rifles raised. A 3rd figure followed, unarmored, in the pristine white of an overseer. Thorn. Calibrator, Thorn's amplified voice boomed across the rooftop, cutting through the wind. Anomaly detected. Stand down for recalibration. Resistance is illogical. Kale and Elian reached the platform. Kale vaulted into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over a control panel, not with his eyes, but with the pure instinct of his mental link. Elian scrambled in behind him, his hands gripping the back of the seat. They are a threat to the system, Thorn's voice continued, cold and dispassionate. They are a malfunction. Neutralize them. The enforcers raised their rifles. The air crackled with energy as the plasma cells charged. There was no time. The platform's engine was still warming up. They were a stationary target. Kyle closed his eyes. He didn't focus on the controls. He focused on Elian. He reached across the bond, grabbing onto Elian's presence, his life, his soul. He poured everything he was into that connection, his fear, his desperation, his defiance, and the fierce, burning core of his love. And together, they pushed back. It was not a physical force. It was a wave of pure, concentrated psychic energy, a scream of raw emotion and shared existence. The two enforcers cried out, staggering back, their hands flying to their helmets as if to ward off a physical blow. Their advanced targeting systems, linked directly to their neural interfaces, were overwhelmed by the feedback, a flood of data they could not process. Love, loss, hope, despair. 1,000 years of human feeling concentrated into a single, devastating blast. Overseer Thorn, shielded by his own dampeners, was unaffected, but his eyes widened behind his lenses in what might have been surprise. He had witnessed a myth, a weapon he did not understand. It was the opening they needed. Kale slammed the throttle forward. The platform lurched, detaching from its mooring with a screech of metal, and shot out over the edge of the building. They were falling for a heart-stopping second before the repulsor lifts caught, stabilizing them. They hung there, suspended 1,000 meters above the city's glittering canyons. Below, on the rooftop, Thorn watched them go, a silent white statue against the chaos of the city lights. He did not order a pursuit. Kyle knew why. They were an anomaly that could not be calibrated, a bond that could not be broken. To the system, they were no longer a problem to be solved. They were simply an error to be deleted. Every patrol, every sensor in the city would now be hunting them. They were alone, in a stolen, slow-moving vehicle, with an entire world turned against them. Kale looked at Elian. Elian looked back, his face streaked with grime, his eyes reflecting the endless city lights. He was smiling, a real, genuine, breathtaking smile. He reached out and placed his hand over Kyle's on the control yoke. The contact was electric. Kyle felt no fear. He felt no panic. For the first time in his life, his mind was utterly, completely silent. No diagnostics, no analysis, just the steady, warm presence of the man beside him and the vast, unknown darkness ahead. He squeezed Elian's hand, turned the platform away from the cold, orderly lights of the city, and flew towards the horizon. The world outside the city was a sensory deluge. Kale had seen it only in simulations, sterile and curated representations of nature. The reality was a chaotic, overwhelming masterpiece. The air, unfiltered and wild, was the first shock. It was thick with 1,000 scents he couldn't name. Damp earth, decaying leaves, the sharp perfume of night-blooming flowers, the clean, mineral smell of distant water. It was the scent of Elian's apartment, magnified 1,000,000 times. It was the scent of life itself. He flew the maintenance platform low, following the tangled, dark ribbon of a river. the machine's primitive navigation system utterly useless in this untamed landscape. Their heat signature would be a beacon to any consortium patrol. But here, under the thick canopy of ancient trees, they were shielded, at least for now. They landed in a small clearing by the riverbank as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of violet and rose. The silence was another shock. It wasn't the sterile, soundproofed silence of his unit, but a living silence, filled with the whisper of wind in the leaves, the murmur of water over stones, the distant cry of an unseen creature. Kyle stepped out of the platform onto soft, uneven ground. He stumbled, his body accustomed to the perfectly flat, predictable surfaces of the city. Elian laughed, a soft, warm sound that seemed to belong here. He hopped down easily, his feet finding their purchase in the dirt. "Welcome to the real," he said, spreading his arms wide, a gesture that encompassed the trees, the river, the sky. Kyle just stood there, his senses firing on all cylinders. He could feel the moisture in the air on his skin, the texture of a fallen leaf under his shoe, the gentle, rhythmic pulse of the life all around him. It was too much. It was a sensory overload that threatened to short-circuit his calibrated mind. He felt a wave of dizziness, a neurological panic. He was uncalibrated, uncontrolled, lost. He felt a hand on his arm. Elian. The touch was gentle, grounding, easy. Elian sent through the bond. The thought, not a word, but a feeling of calm, a slow, deep breath. Just be. You don't have to analyze it. You just have to feel it. Kel closed his eyes, leaning into the touch, into the connection. He let Elian's calm wash over him, anchoring him in the swirling chaos of this new reality. He focused on a single sensation, the warmth of Elian's hand on his arm. He took a breath, a real breath, of real air. It filled his lungs, and for the first time, it felt like his own. When he opened his eyes again, the panic had receded. The world was still overwhelming, but it was no longer terrifying. It was beautiful. The rising sun caught the droplets of dew on a spider's web, turning it into a net of diamonds. The river flowed, indifferent and eternal. He was a part of this, not a component in a machine, but a thread in a vast, living tapestry. He turned to Elian, who was watching him, his face illuminated by the dawn. In his eyes, Kyle saw not just affection, but a deep, profound understanding. He had seen Kyle at his most broken, his most terrified, and he had not run. He had stayed. He had waited. "I don't know how to do this," Kyle confessed, his voice quiet. "How to be here." "Neither do I," Elian admitted with a small smile. "We'll learn together." The future was a vast, terrifying unknown. They were fugitives. They had no food, no shelter beyond the broken canopy of the platform. The consortium would not stop hunting them. Their life of quiet, placid safety was over, exchanged for a life of constant uncertainty and risk. But as Kyle looked at Elian, at the man who had shattered his world only to rebuild it into something real, he felt a profound sense of peace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the river stone. He held it out to Elian. It looked different here, in the natural light. The dark, smooth surface seemed to hold the depth of the night sky, the faint lines on it like constellations. Elian took it, his fingers brushing Kale's. He didn't look at the stone. He looked at Kyle. "Fated mates," Elian said softly, the words a statement, not a question. A pre-rational delusion, inefficient, illogical. Kyle's voice was dry, but a faint smile touched his lips for the first time. He was quoting himself, the man he used to be. A lifetime ago. The most dangerous myths, Ilian murmured, completing the thought, are the ones that turn out to be true. He stepped closer, and the small space between them vanished. He didn't kiss him. The moment was too fragile, too profound for that. Instead, he rested his forehead against Kale's, their eyes closing in unison. They stood there for a long time, two souls connected, two halves of a whole, breathing in the wild, uncertain air of their newfound freedom. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the trees. Their journey was just beginning. It would be hard, and it would be dangerous. But they were not alone. Kale felt the solid ground beneath his feet, the warmth of the sun on his face, the steady presence of Elian beside him, within him. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Kale, and he was home.